There is a photograph, not well known, taken sometime in the early 1960s in a place called Tintwistle, a village in Derbyshire, where the hills roll down in shades of gray and green and the sky stays low most of the year. In it, a young woman stands in front of a primary school classroom, chalk dust probably still on her hands, her hair dark and her expression serious in the way of people who have not yet learned to perform for cameras. She is 21, maybe 22. She is a school teacher. She makes her own clothes on a second-hand sewing machine, because that is what you did if you had taste, but no money, if you grew up working class in post-war England and wanted to look like something other than what you were supposed to be. She would later say she hated teaching, that she felt trapped by it, but in the photograph she looks like someone still trying to do the right thing, still moving along the path that had been laid out: marriage, work, respectability, the small, modest future available to a girl from a family that had not had very much. Within a few years, she would be gone from that classroom. She would leave her first husband, take her young son, and move to London. She would meet a man who dressed like a teddy boy and talked about revolution and pop culture and situationism and the commodification of rebellion, and together they would open a shop on the King's Road that sold clothing so strange and so sexually confrontational that people crossed the street to avoid walking past it. She would learn to cut and drape and construct garments without formal training, working from instinct and old costume books and a kind of anarchic historical imagination. She would dress the Sex Pistols. She would put safety pins through fabric and skin became indistinguishable in the visual grammar she helped invent. She would make clothes that were not meant to make you beautiful, but to make you dangerous, to make you a problem, to turn the body into a manifesto. But that comes later. First there is the girl in Tintwistle, in Derbyshire, where the wind came cold off the moors and the future looked like a very narrow road. She was born Vivienne Isabel Swire on April 8, 1941, in the village of Glossop, Derbyshire, in the middle of a war that was reshaping the world, whether you lived in London or in a small northern village where not much seemed to happen at all. Her mother, Dora, worked in a cotton mill. Her father, Gordon, was a cobbler, a maker and mender of shoes, a trade that would come to mean something later. The idea of making things with your hands, of construction and repair, of taking apart the structure of an object to understand how it held together. They were working-class people, not poor, but far from comfortable, living in an England still organized by the strict codes of class that determined what you could hope for, how you could speak, what kind of life was available to you. She grew up in a terrain of austerity. Rationing continued well into the 1950s. There was not much color, not much excess. Clothes were mended and remade. Nothing was wasted. The landscape itself seemed to enforce a kind of plainness, the gray stone houses, the wet streets, the moor stretching out under skies that rarely broke into full sun. It was a world that taught you to make do, to be practical, to not expect very much. But she was not a practical child, not in temperament. She read voraciously history, novels, anything she could find. She drew. She looked at pictures in magazines, at images of actresses and aristocrats and historical figures in elaborate dress. She was fascinated, even then, by the visual language of status and rebellion, by the way clothing could signify who you were or who you wanted to overthrow. England in the post-war years was obsessed with class in a way that was both oppressive and theatrically visible. Everyone could read the signs, the cut of a coat, the accent, the shoes, and she was learning to read them too, learning the grammar of a language she would later take apart and violently reassemble. Her family moved to Holbrook, a small village near Derby, when she was still young. She attended Glossopdale Grammar School, where she did well enough, though she would later describe herself as having been uninterested in formal education, more drawn to the things she could teach herself. She wanted to be an artist, or thought she did, but there was no clear path to that from where she was. Art school was a possibility, but it meant money and confidence and a kind of self-belief that was hard to sustain when everything around you suggested that people like you did not become artists. So she chose something safer. She enrolled at Harrow Art School for a single term, then left and trained as a primary school teacher at the Teacher Training College in Harrow. It was practical. It was respectable. It was what you did. She married young, at 21, to a man named Derek Westwood, who worked in a factory. They had a son, Benjamin, in 1963. She taught at a primary school in Willesden, North London. She sewed her own clothes in the evenings, copying designs from fashion magazines, adjusting patterns, trying to make herself look like something other than a schoolteacher in a London suburb. She was restless. She would later describe this period as a kind of suffocation, a sense that the life she was living was someone else's life, that she had made a series of choices that led to a place she did not want to be, but she did not yet have the language for what she wanted instead. And then, in 1965, she met Malcolm McLaren. He was a year younger than her, a student at various art schools, Chiswick Polytechnic, Harrow Art School, Goldsmiths, though he never seemed to finish anywhere, always moving, always talking, always reading manifestos and thinking about pop culture as a site of disruption. He dressed like a teddy boy, in draped jackets and crepe-soled shoes, and he had ideas about everything, about rock and roll, about fashion, about the spectacle, about how you could take the energy of youth rebellion and turn it into something that could not be commodified, or could be commodified in a way that exploded the whole system from within. He had grown up in North London, raised by his grandmother after his mother remarried, and he had the charisma of someone who had learned early to narrate his own life as though it were already a legend. Vivienne was drawn to him immediately. He was nothing like her husband, nothing like the life she had built. He talked about things she had only read about. He made rebellion sound not like a failure of character, but like an intellectual position, a way of moving through the world. They began an affair. She left Derek Westwood. She would keep his name for the rest of her life, a fact that seems almost perverse, given how completely she would leave behind everything else from that first marriage. She and Malcolm moved in together. She stopped teaching. She started helping him with his ideas. In 1971, they opened a shop. The shop was at 430 Kings Road, Chelsea, in a building that had previously housed a clothing store called Paradise Garage. Malcolm had a vision for it. Something that would sell the clothes of 1950s rock and roll rebellion, the gear of teddy boys and rockers, the subcultural uniforms that had been, briefly, a way for working-class kids to mark themselves as outside the system. They called it Let It Rock. The front of the shop was painted black. Inside, the walls were covered with photographs of Elvis and Gene Vincent and James Dean, images of a specifically American rebellion that British teenagers had imported and transformed. They sold draped jackets and drainpipe trousers and brothel creepers, the clothes of a youth culture that was already a decade gone, already nostalgic. Vivienne made many of the clothes herself. She had no formal training in pattern cutting or tailoring, but she had her sewing machine and a growing collection of books on historical costume and a willingness to take things apart to see how they were constructed. Malcolm handled the vision, the theoretical framework, the cultural references. Vivienne handled the making. It was a collaboration that would define the next decade of both their lives, though it was never entirely clear where one of them ended and the other began. Who had which idea first? Who was leading and who was following? Later, after they split, this ambiguity would become a source of bitterness and legal battles over credit. But in the early days, there was just the work, the shared project, of trying to make something that had not existed before. The shop did well enough. Teddy boys came in, and rockabillys, and people who wanted to dress like they were living in a more exciting decade. But Malcolm and Vivienne were already getting bored. Nostalgia was safe. It was backward-looking. What they wanted was something that would not comfort anyone, something that would make people uncomfortable, that would turn fashion into a form of aggression. In 1972, they changed the shop's name to Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die, a phrase taken from a biker's jacket. The stock shifted. Leather jackets, motorcycle gear, chains, studs. The aesthetic was tougher, more explicitly violent. The shop began to attract a different crowd. Younger kids who were not interested in 1950s nostalgia, but in something rawer, something that felt contemporary and furious. And then, in 1974, they changed it again. This time the name was just 3 letters, SEX. The window display was pornographic in its implications: rubber and leather, chains and zippers, mannequins in postures that suggested bondage. The sign above the door was pink, the word spelled out in childish rubber letters. Inside, the walls were padded and pink, the atmosphere deliberately claustrophobic. The clothes were something else entirely. Vivienne had begun designing garments that had no precedent in fashion, things that seemed to come from some violent, sexualized fever dream of British history and street culture and fetish wear. T-shirts with images of topless cowboys, of naked boys, of chicken bones arranged to spell out rock. Trousers with straps that connected the legs so you could not walk normally. Bondage jackets with sleeves that zipped together behind the back. Shirts ripped and held together with safety pins. Everything was confrontational, deliberately obscene, designed to alienate and provoke. The shop became a gathering place. Kids came in who did not have money to buy anything but who wanted to be near whatever was happening there. Malcolm was starting to manage a group of boys who could barely play their instruments but who had the right look, the right sneer. They were called the Sex Pistols, and Vivienne and Malcolm dressed them in clothes from the shop, torn shirts and bondage trousers and T-shirts with slogans that were designed to offend. The shop, the band, and the clothes became inseparable, a single aesthetic project that was less about music or fashion than about a total attitude, a refusal of everything polite society expected. Vivienne was making it all. She worked in the back room of the shop, cutting and stitching and pinning. She had no training, but she had an instinct for the body, for how fabric could reshape and constrain and emphasize. She was drawn to historical garments, to corsetry and 18th-century tailoring, and the way clothes had once been used to discipline and display the body. But she was also drawn to the street, to the way kids customized their own clothes, to the anarchic creativity of subculture. She put them together, the historical and the contemporary, the high and the low, the structured and the destroyed. The result was fashion that was both deeply knowledgeable and completely unhinged, that looked like it had been made by someone who understood the rules and had decided to break them in the most violent way possible. The clothes were not meant to be beautiful. They were meant to be difficult. A bondage suit was not comfortable to wear. A T-shirt that said Cambridge Rapist was not something you could wear to work. These were garments designed to mark you as outside, as hostile, as refusing the social contract, and that was the point. Malcolm and Vivienne were not interested in making fashion that helped you fit in. They were interested in fashion as a tool of refusal. Punk, as a movement, as a sound and a look and a set of attitudes, emerged from a specific moment in mid-1970s Britain, a period of economic crisis, political stagnation, and a pervasive sense that the post-war consensus had failed, that the promise of prosperity and social mobility had been a lie, especially if you were young and working class and living in a country that seemed to be falling apart. Unemployment was rising, the welfare state was fraying, the older generation's music, progressive rock, heavy metal, even the hippie idealism of the 60s, felt bloated and irrelevant. There was a hunger for something that matched the ugliness of the moment, something that did not pretend things were going to be okay. Malcolm and Vivienne did not invent punk. It was happening in New York, too, at CBGB, with bands like the Ramones and Television. But they gave it a visual language. The Sex Pistols, dressed in Vivienne's clothes, looked like nothing anyone had seen before, part street thug, part historical fetishist, part walking provocation. The safety pin, the tartan bondage trousers, the ripped t-shirts held together with pins and scrawled slogans, these became the uniform. Other kids copied it. Other designers, or people who wanted to be designers, started making their own versions. By 1976, there was a scene. In 1976, Vivienne and Malcolm renamed the shop again. This time it was Seditionaries, Clothes for Heroes. The new name was less about sex and more about politics, or at least the aesthetics of political rebellion. The clothes had slogans now, printed in bold letters: anarchy, destroy. There were shirts with swastikas and inverted crucifixes, images designed not to express any coherent ideology, but to offend, to make the wearer unignorable. Vivienne was interested in the semiotics of power and transgression, in how certain images could be emptied of their historical meaning and turned into pure visual aggression. It was a dangerous game. Some people understood it as satire, as a way of short-circuiting the symbols that had been used to control and terrorize. Others did not understand it at all, or understood it in the worst possible way. The Anarchy collection, which emerged from the Seditionaries period, is what most people think of when they think of punk fashion. The bondage trousers with straps connecting the legs, the destroyed t-shirts with zippers and pins. The tartan, specifically the use of Royal Stuart tartan, a pattern associated with Scottish nobility, repurposed as the fabric of rebellion. Vivienne had a deep and complicated relationship with Britishness, with the history of the British Empire and its class structures and its mythology of itself. She was working class, from the north, and she had spent her whole life aware of the ways that Britishness was used to exclude and discipline people like her. But she was also fascinated by British history, by its eccentricity and its pageantry, by the sheer strangeness of a culture that put so much weight on tradition and ceremony. The tartan was a way of claiming that history and twisting it, of taking a symbol of aristocratic legitimacy and making it into the uniform of the street. The Sex Pistols released Anarchy in the UK in November of 1976. It was not a sophisticated song, not musically, but it was a perfect distillation of the moment, furious, sneering, nihilistic, a rejection of everything. The band appeared on television in December, on a talk show hosted by Bill Grundy, and they swore on live television, and it became a scandal, front-page news. Suddenly punk was not just a subculture, it was a moral panic. Politicians gave speeches about it. Parents worried, the tabloids ran headlines about the death of decency, and the clothes were part of the story. Vivienne's designs were held up as evidence of social decay, of what happened when you let the young people run wild. She was 35 years old. She had spent most of her life as a school teacher, a wife, a mother. Now she was being described in the newspapers as a threat to civilization. It was absurd. It was also intoxicating. She had found, late, and almost by accident, a way to matter, a way to make work that had an impact on the world beyond the small circle of people who happened to see it. Fashion, she was learning, could be a weapon. But Malcolm and Vivienne were not unified in their vision. Not really. Malcolm was interested in punk as a kind of performance art, a spectacular disruption that would burn brightly and then disappear. He quoted the Situationists, talked about détournement and the society of the spectacle. He wanted punk to destroy itself before it could be absorbed by the mainstream. Vivienne, on the other hand, was becoming more interested in the craft of making clothes, in the technical challenges of construction and pattern cutting, in fashion as a discipline with its own history and its own rigor. She was reading more, looking at museum collections, studying historical garments. She was starting to think of herself not just as someone who made clothes for a scene, but as a designer. In 1977, the Sex Pistols fell apart in spectacular fashion, disintegrating during a disastrous tour of the United States. Malcolm continued managing bands, but punk as a movement was already fragmenting, splitting into different scenes and sounds. Vivienne kept working. She and Malcolm were still together, still running the shop, but the dynamic between them was changing. She was less willing to defer to his vision, more insistent on her own ideas. In 1980, she showed her first full collection under her own name at Olympia in London. It was called Pirates, and with it she stepped decisively away from punk and toward something else entirely. The Pirates collection was a rupture. Where the punk clothes had been aggressive and confrontational, these were romantic, swashbuckling, flamboyant. There were billowing shirts and breeches, frock coats and tricorn hats, garments that looked like they had been pulled from an 18th-century privateer's wardrobe, and then roughed up, torn, restitched, layered with stripes and plaids and clashing patterns. The silhouette was loose androgynous, the fabrics luxurious velvets and silks and fine wools, a far cry from the rubber and bondage leather of sex. The models walked out barefoot, their hair wild, and the effect was not threatening but theatrical, a fantasy of adventure and freedom. The collection was inspired, in part, by Vivienne's reading. She had been looking at images of pirates, at the idea of people who lived outside the law, who created their own codes and their own societies on the margins of empire. She had also been studying historical pattern cutting, looking at how garments were constructed in the 18th century, at the mathematical precision of a well-cut coat. The Pirates collection was punk in its attitude. It was still about refusal, still about living outside the system. But it was not punk in its aesthetic. It was something more complex, more layered, more interested in beauty. The fashion press did not quite know what to make of it. Some critics loved it, saw it as the beginning of something new. Others dismissed it as a costume party, as Vivienne playing dress-up. But the collection had an immediate impact on a certain kind of young person in London. The new romantics, as they came to be called, adopted the look, the frilly shirts, the pirate boots, the sense of dressing as though you were in a historical drama. Clubs like the Blitz became stages for this kind of self-presentation, and Vivienne's designs were part of the visual language of that scene, even though she herself was not particularly interested in nightlife or in being part of any scene. Malcolm hated pirates. He thought it was a betrayal of punk's anti-fashion stance, a slide into exactly the kind of bourgeois aestheticism that punk was supposed to destroy. They fought about it. The relationship, which had always been volatile, became more so. But Vivienne did not back down. She kept designing. The next few collections continued the trajectory away from punk and toward a more historicist, more craft-focused vision of fashion. Savages in 1981 mixed Native American references with Highland dress, mudcloth prints with tartan. Buffalo Girls, also in 1981, featured enormous circular skirts and ragged hems, a kind of post-apocalyptic prairie romanticism. The silhouettes were getting bigger, more dramatic. The references were ranging across history and geography, pulling from colonialism and resistance, from the British Empire and the cultures it had attempted to crush. Vivienne was thinking about history not as a set of static images, but as a field of conflict, of violence and appropriation and survival. In 1982, she showed Nostalgia of Mud, a collection that referenced the dress of Peruvian mountain people and included draped, wrapped garments that looked almost sculptural on the body. By this point, she was working with a small team. She had hired a young pattern cutter and was learning more formal techniques, though her approach was still intuitive, still driven by a sense of what looked right rather than by adherence to any established method. In 1983, Vivienne and Malcolm finally ended their romantic relationship, though they continued to work together for a while longer. The split was painful and complicated, marked by disagreements over credit and money and the direction of the work. Malcolm would later claim that he had been the true visionary behind punk, that Vivienne had been his instrument. Vivienne would insist, with increasing vehemence as the years went on, that she had been the one making the clothes, that Malcolm had contributed ideas, but that she had been the designer, the maker, the one whose hands had actually shaped the garments. The truth was probably somewhere in between, or more likely, The truth was that the collaboration had been so entangled that it was impossible to separate one from the other. But the myth each of them constructed, in retrospect, was simpler, and each myth required the diminishment of the other. After the split, Vivienne continued designing. She was entering her 40s now, an age at which many designers have already established their signature and are repeating it, refining it, growing comfortable. Vivienne was moving in the opposite direction. Each collection was a new experiment, a new obsession. She was becoming more interested in historical fashion as a technical discipline, in how garments were constructed in the past, and how those techniques could be brought into the present. She started working with a man named Gary Ness, who would become her long-term pattern cutter and collaborator, and together they began exploring the architecture of historical clothing. The boning and draping of corsets, the complex multi-panel construction of 18th-century frock coats, the precise geometry of a well-cut sleeve. In 1985, she showed Mini Crini, a collection that featured short, full skirts supported by crinolines, an explicit reference to Victorian undergarments brought out into the open and shrunk down to mini-length. The effect was both historical and absurd, a collision of propriety and exposure. The models wore their hair in elaborate styles, their makeup pale and artificial, and the overall impression was of a kind of perverse dollhouse elegance. This was the period in which Vivienne's design philosophy began to take its mature form. She was interested in what she called dressing up, the idea that clothing should not be comfortable or easy, that it should transform the body, that it should require effort and intention to wear. She despised casual fashion, hated jeans and sneakers and anything that suggested that the body should be allowed to remain in its natural state. She believed that fashion was about construction, about building a silhouette, about using fabric and structure to create a shape that was more interesting, more beautiful, more confrontational than the body itself. She was also interested in Englishness, in what it meant to be British, in the history of British dress and British eccentricity. This was complicated territory for someone who had spent her youth trying to destroy the British establishment. But Vivienne was not interested in consistency. She was interested in history as a living, contested thing, and she saw British history as a resource, a set of forms and symbols that could be reclaimed and reinterpreted. She started using Harris tweed and English wool, fabrics that were associated with the British countryside and with a certain kind of upper-class traditionalism, but she cut them in exaggerated, almost cartoonish shapes, or mixed them with punk elements, tartan suits with safety pins, tailored jackets with slogans. In 1987, she showed Harris Tweed, a collection that was a direct engagement with British country dressing, with the clothes of the aristocracy tweed suits, waistcoats, riding jackets. But the proportions were wrong, deliberately exaggerated, the jackets too short or too long, the hats too tall, the whole thing pushed into the realm of caricature. She was not celebrating the British aristocracy. She was taking its visual language and making it strange, turning it into a costume, exposing the performativity of class itself. This marked the beginning of what would become her signature approach, taking the clothes of the British establishment, the visual codes of power and tradition, and remixing them with punk's aggression and irony, with historical references that complicated the picture, with cuts and constructions that were technically virtuosic, but also visually unsettling. She was creating a fashion that was both deeply English and deeply critical of Englishness, that loved the history and wanted to smash it at the same time. The fashion world was starting to take her seriously. She was no longer just the woman who had dressed the Sex Pistols. She was being recognized as a designer with a distinctive vision, someone who was thinking about fashion in ways that were intellectually ambitious and technically skilled. She started showing in Paris, the traditional center of high fashion. She opened more shops. She began building something that resembled a fashion house, a business, though she was never particularly good at the business side, often running out of money, always more interested in the next collection than in managing the logistics of production and distribution. In 1989, she met Andreas Kronthaler, a young Austrian fashion student who was nearly 25 years younger than her. He had come to study at the School of Applied Arts in Vienna and was obsessed with Vivienne's work. They met when he came to work for her, and almost immediately, they fell in love. He became her assistant, then her collaborator, then her partner in every sense. They married in 1992. He was in his 20s. She was in her 50s. The age difference was scandalous to some, but Vivienne did not care about scandal, or rather, she welcomed it. Andreas understood her work in a way that felt like partnership, like mutual obsession. He would remain by her side for the rest of her life, eventually becoming the creative force behind the label as she aged, though she always remained the name, the figurehead, the voice. The 1990s were a period of consolidation and expansion. Vivienne launched multiple lines: Vivienne Westwood Gold Label, Red Label, Anglomania. She opened stores in London, Paris, New York, Tokyo. The fashion world, which had spent the 80s being dominated by Italian and French designers, was becoming more interested in British eccentricity, and Vivienne was the avatar of that eccentricity, the proof that British fashion could be both intellectually serious and totally unhinged. The Anglomania line, which launched in 1993, was a distillation of her approach: English historical references, punk energy, exaggerated silhouettes, a sense of dressing as performance. The name was perfect. It suggested both a love of England and a kind of mania, an obsession that had tipped over into madness. The clothes were tartan suits and corsets, platform shoes that were so high they were almost unwearable, tailoring that was precise and beautiful and then deliberately distorted, pushed out of proportion. She was making fashion that required commitment from the wearer, that could not be worn casually or without thought. You had to mean it. You had to be willing to look strange. The corset became one of her signature garments. She had been fascinated by corsets since the punk days, when she had started experimenting with bondage gear and the idea of constraining the body. But now she was thinking about the corset historically as a garment that had been used to shape and discipline the female body, to create an idealized silhouette. She studied 18th century corsetry, the complex boning and lacing, the way a well-made corset could redistribute the body's weight and create a posture that was both elegant and artificial. She made corsets that were beautiful and uncomfortable, that pushed the breasts up and the waist in, that turned the body into a sculptural object. Some feminists criticized her for this, argued that the corset was a tool of patriarchal oppression, that no woman should willingly put herself into such a garment. Vivienne's response was characteristically combative. She argued that the corset was empowering, that it allowed women to construct their own bodies, to refuse the naturalism of contemporary fashion. She wore corsets herself, often over her clothes, and she moved through the world with a posture that was upright and imperious, a refusal of the slouch and casualness of modern dress. She was becoming, in her 50s and 60s, a public figure in a way that went beyond fashion. She had always been political, but now she was using her visibility to speak out about the things she cared about. She was an environmentalist, deeply concerned about climate change and overconsumption. This was a complicated position for someone who ran a fashion house, an industry built on the idea of selling new things every season, of encouraging people to buy and discard and buy again. Vivienne was aware of the contradiction, but she did not try to resolve it in any conventional way. Instead, she argued that people should buy less, but buy better, that they should invest in well-made clothes that would last, that they should resist the fast fashion model. She started including political slogans in her runway shows, using the catwalk as a platform for activism. One show featured models carrying signs that read, "Save the Rainforest." Another included images of climate data and warnings about environmental collapse. In 2006, she was made a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire for her services to fashion. She accepted the honor an act that seemed, on its face, like a capitulation, like the ultimate proof that the rebel had been absorbed by the establishment she had once tried to destroy. But Vivienne attended the ceremony at Buckingham Palace wearing no underwear, and when photographers asked her to pose, she spun around and let her skirt fly up, revealing the fact to anyone who was paying attention. It was a perfect Vivienne gesture: accept the honor, take the title, and then immediately undermine it, make it into a joke, expose the absurdity of the whole apparatus. She was asked about the contradiction many times. How could she be a dame? How could she be running a luxury fashion house? How could she be participating in the very systems she claimed to oppose? Her answers were never entirely satisfying, at least not to people who wanted ideological consistency. She would say that she was working within the system to change it, that fashion gave her a platform, that she could do more good as a visible designer than she could as a marginal figure. She would also simply refuse the premise, argue that she did not see any contradiction, that she had always been interested in both rebellion and tradition, in tearing things down and building them up. The truth, perhaps, is that Vivienne was not particularly interested in ideological purity. She was interested in action, in using whatever tools were available to make the work she wanted to make and to say the things she wanted to say. She was not a theorist. She was not interested in constructing a coherent philosophy. She was a maker, and she moved through the world with the confidence of someone who had survived being poor and being dismissed and being told she was too old and too loud and too much, and who had simply kept working. The 2000s and the 2010s were, for Vivienne, a period of both retrospection and continued production. She was in her 60s and then her 70s, an age at which most designers have retired or have handed over the creative reins to younger collaborators. Vivienne kept designing, though increasingly Andreas was the one doing much of the hands-on work, translating her ideas into garments, managing the technical side of the collections. The dynamic between them was affectionate and collaborative. He understood her vision so completely that it was difficult to say where one ended and the other began. In some ways, it was a return to the dynamic she had had with Malcolm in the early days, but without the volatility, without the competition. Andreas adored her. He supported her. He let her be the center of attention while doing much of the invisible labor that made the work possible. The collections continued to explore the same obsession's history: Englishness, the body, the politics of dress. There were collections inspired by 18th century painting, by African textiles, by punk. Again she kept returning to punk, reworking the safety pins and the tartan and the bondage straps, as though she could never quite leave it behind. The quality of the work varied. Some collections felt vital and strange. Others felt like repetitions, like a designer going through motions that had once been revolutionary, but had become familiar. The fashion press was generally respectful, but not always enthusiastic. Vivienne was an icon, but she was no longer setting the agenda. Younger designers had taken up some of her ideas, the mix of historical and contemporary, the use of fashion as political speech, and had run with them in their own directions. But Vivienne did not seem particularly concerned with staying relevant in the way that many designers are. She was not chasing trends. She was not trying to appeal to a younger audience. She was making the work she wanted to make, and she was using her platform to talk about the things she cared about. She became increasingly focused on environmental activism. She started an organization called Climate Revolution, which aimed to raise awareness about climate change and to push for policy changes. She appeared at protests, often wearing her own designs, corsets and tartan, and platforms looking like no one else on the street. In her 70s, she was arrested for protesting fracking. She chained herself to a railing outside the Prime Minister's residence to protest austerity. She showed up at a hearing for Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks founder, wearing a bright yellow suit and holding a sign. She was past the age where most people retreat into privacy, into the safety of legacy, but Vivienne seemed to be accelerating, becoming more public, more insistent, more willing to make herself into a spectacle. There was something both admirable and exhausting about it. She was a woman who had never learned to be quiet, who had never accepted that there was a proper way to behave, who had spent her entire life refusing to perform the role that had been assigned to her. She had been a working-class girl who was supposed to become a teacher and a wife. She had become a designer. She had been the girlfriend of Malcolm McLaren, the woman behind the man. She had become more famous than him and had outlasted him. Malcolm died in 2010 of cancer, and whatever bitterness had been between them remained unresolved. She had been a punk, and then she had been not punk, and then she had been a dame, and none of it had stopped her from being exactly who she wanted to be, which was someone who would not be told what to do. Fashion, as an industry, had changed enormously over the decades of Vivienne's career. When she started, it was still a small, relatively insular world, dominated by Paris and a few Italian houses, operating on a seasonal schedule that felt almost leisurely compared to what it would become. By the time she was in her 70s, fashion was global, fast, driven by social media and celebrity and a relentless churn of product. The idea of a designer as an auteur, as someone with a singular vision that unfolded over decades, was becoming rarer. Most brands were owned by conglomerates. Most designers were employees, subject to the demands of investors and market research and quarterly earnings reports. Vivienne's brand remained independent longer than most, though it was never financially stable in the way that a corporate-backed brand could be. There were always rumors of debt, of struggles to make payroll, of stores closing. She was not a good businesswoman, not in the conventional sense. She was interested in the work, not in the logistics. She kept making collections that were expensive to produce and difficult to sell. She kept using her runway shows to make political statements that alienated some customers. She kept being herself, which was not always good for business, but she also built something that lasted. The Vivienne Westwood brand, as it existed in the 2010s and into the 2020s, was one of the few remaining examples of a fashion house that still felt like it had a vision, a point of view, a set of obsessions that were specific to a person rather than to a market analysis. Young people, especially in Japan and Korea, loved her work, not because it was trendy, but because it was strange, because it allowed you to dress like you were making a statement, like you were part of a history that was larger than the moment. She kept appearing at fashion shows, kept giving interviews, kept being photographed. She was in her 80s and still wearing platforms and corsets, still dyeing her hair orange, still refusing to dress like an old woman was supposed to dress. She looked like herself, which is to say she looked like no one else. She had aged in public, and she had not tried to hide it, but she had also not submitted to it, not in the way that aging is usually understood as a process of diminishment and retreat. She was still present, still visible, still loud. In December of 2022, Vivienne Westwood died. She was 81. The announcement came from her official social media accounts, a simple statement that she had died peacefully, surrounded by her family. The news was met with an outpouring of tributes from across the fashion world and beyond, designers who had been influenced by her, activists who had worked with her, people who had simply admired her willingness to be difficult and uncompromising and strange. The tributes emphasized different aspects of her legacy. Some focused on her role in punk, on the way she had given a visual language to a moment of cultural rupture. Others focused on her environmentalism, on her late-life activism. Still others focused on her clothes, on the technical brilliance of her tailoring, on the way she had brought historical techniques into contemporary fashion. But what all the tributes shared was a recognition that Vivienne had been singular, that there was no one else like her, that she had moved through the world on her own terms and had refused to be absorbed or neutralized or made safe. She had been difficult. She had been contradictory. She had made beautiful things and ugly things and things that were both at once. She had dressed the Sex Pistols and been made a dame. She had preached anti-consumerism while running a fashion house. She had been a punk and a traditionalist, a revolutionary and a nostalgist, and she had never seen any reason to resolve those contradictions. Andreas Kronthaler, in the statements following her death, said that she had died as she had lived on her own terms, uncompromising, surrounded by love. He would continue to design under the Vivienne Westwood name, as he had been doing increasingly for the last several years. But it was clear that something had ended, that the particular force of her presence, her voice, her willingness to provoke and irritate and inspire, was gone. The legacy of Vivienne Westwood is complicated, as legacies often are, especially for figures who lived long enough and publicly enough to accumulate contradictions. She is remembered as the mother of punk fashion, the woman who gave that movement its look, its visual ferocity. That is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Punk was a very brief period in her long career, and while it was foundational, it was also something she moved past, something she complicated and revised and sometimes seemed almost impatient with. She is also remembered as one of the great British designers, the inheritor of a tradition of eccentric, intellectual British fashion that includes figures like Charles Frederick Worth and Hardy Amies and Alexander McQueen, whom she taught in his early years at Central St. Martin's and who absorbed from her a sense of fashion as tragedy and spectacle, as something that could be beautiful and violent at the same time. McQueen's work, with its historical references and its dark romanticism and its sense of the body as a site of both transformation and suffering, owes an enormous debt to Vivienne, even as it took her ideas in directions she might not have chosen herself. But perhaps the most significant aspect of her legacy is the example she set of what it could mean to have a long career as a designer, as a woman, as someone who refused to soften or disappear. Fashion is an industry that is notoriously ageist, that tends to value youth and novelty in the appearance of effortless cool. Vivienne was never cool. She was too intense, too earnest, too willing to lecture and hector and insist. She dressed like someone who was making a point, always, and the point was usually several points at once, some of them contradictory. She aged in public and did not pretend to be anything other than an old woman who still had things to say and things to make. She also set an example of what it could mean to be political as an artist, as a maker of things that are also commodities. This is difficult territory. Fashion is not a neutral medium. It is imbricated in capitalism, in the production and consumption of goods, in systems of labor and exploitation and waste. Vivienne was aware of all this, and she spoke about it, but she also kept making clothes, kept running a business, kept participating in the system. Her response to the contradiction was not to withdraw, but to keep pushing, to use the platform she had to advocate for the things she believed in, to try to change the industry from within. Whether that was effective is a matter of debate. She did not stop climate change, she did not dismantle the fashion industry's exploitive labor practices. But she did keep the conversation going, kept insisting that fashion could be more than just decoration, that it could be a form of speech, a way of engaging with the world. The clothes themselves remain. They are in museum collections now, at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, at the Met in New York, at fashion institutes around the world. They are studied by students, analyzed by scholars, photographed for retrospectives. They look different in museums than they did on the street, on the bodies of people who wore them as acts of allegiance or rebellion. In museums they are precious objects carefully lit and labeled, removed from the context that gave them their charge. But even in that rarefied space they retain something of their original strangeness, their refusal to be easily categorized. A bondage suit from the 1970s displayed behind glass still looks confrontational, still looks like it was made by someone who was trying to provoke a response. A corset from the 1990s still looks like it would be uncomfortable to wear, still looks like it is designed to transform the body into something other than its natural state. A Harris tweed suit from the 2000s still looks like a caricature of Britishness, like a costume from a play that is both reverent and mocking. There is also the question of how the brand will continue without her. Andreas Krondthaler has taken over as the sole creative director, and the collections he has produced since her death have been respectful of her vision while also bearing his own stamp. He is a skilled designer in his own right, with his own sensibility, and the house will continue to produce clothes and show collections and operate stores, but it will be different. Vivienne was not just the designer of the brand. She was the embodiment of it, the voice and the face and the will. Without her, the brand is a brand, a set of aesthetic codes and commercial structures. It is not the same as having the woman herself, with all her contradictions and intensity, still making the work. What remains most vividly, perhaps, is the image of her, the orange hair, the platforms, the corset worn over a t-shirt, the posture that was always upright and defiant, the willingness to look ridiculous if that was what it took to make the point she wanted to make. She was a woman who dressed like she was going to war, or to a costume ball, or to both at once. She was punk and posh, working class and dame, historical and contemporary, serious and absurd. She contained multitudes, and she did not apologize for any of them. In the end, Vivienne Westwood's work was about the body and how it moves through the world, how it can be disciplined and freed, constrained and displayed, made into a site of protest or a work of art. She believed that how you dressed mattered, that it was not superficial but fundamental, that it was a way of declaring who you were and what you believed. She believed that fashion was not just about beauty, but about the power to transform yourself and to challenge the structures that wanted to keep you in your place. She spent her entire life refusing to stay in her place. She was supposed to be a teacher in a small northern village. She became one of the most influential designers of the 20th century. She was supposed to fade into respectability as she aged. She kept protesting and making noise and chaining herself to railings. She was supposed to be one thing, and she kept being many things all at once without apology. There is a kind of freedom in that, in the refusal to be consistent, in the willingness to embrace contradiction as a creative principle. Vivienne Westwood made clothes that were beautiful and uncomfortable, traditional and transgressive, expensive and confrontational. She built a fashion house on the visual language of rebellion and then accepted a title from the Queen. She preached environmentalism and ran a business that sold luxury goods. She was all of these things, and she was unapologetic about all of it. What her life and work suggest in the end is that maybe consistency is overrated, that maybe the most interesting way to move through the world is to refuse to be pinned down, to keep changing and contradicting and surprising yourself and others. She was not a comfortable person. Her work is not comfortable to wear or to look at. But comfort was never the goal. The goal was to make you see differently, to make you think about the body and clothing and power and history in ways you had not thought about them before. The goal was to refuse, and that, perhaps, is the legacy. Not a particular style or a set of garments, though those matter, but an attitude, a way of being in the world that says you do not have to accept the role you were given. You do not have to be quiet or appropriate or consistent. You do not have to make it easy for anyone. You can be difficult. You can be loud. You can be too much. You can keep making work that challenges and provokes and confuses, and you can keep doing it until the very end. Vivienne Westwood did exactly that. She made clothes that looked like armor and like costumes and like arguments. She dressed herself and others in garments that said no, that said look at me, that said you do not get to tell me who I am. She lived a long life, longer than she probably expected, and she used every year of it to make things, and to fight for things, and to refuse to be anything other than exactly who she was. The work is still here. The clothes are still being worn, still being made, still being looked at. The shops are still open. The brand continues. But what is gone is the woman herself, the voice, the orange-haired figure in platforms and corsets and tartan, spinning on the steps of Buckingham Palace, chaining herself to railings in her 70s, making clothes that looked like nothing else and saying things that no one else would say. She was a teacher who became a revolutionary, a mother who became a dame, a punk who became a traditionalist, or maybe she was both all along. She was Vivienne Westwood, and for more than 5 decades she made fashion that mattered, that changed things, that refused to be safe or easy or ignored. And now the work remains, and the contradictions remain, and the memory of a woman who would not, ever, under any circumstances, behave.